As I'm sure you know, I've been making God of War videos for many years now. Most of them consist of discussing moments from the games and outside sources like the comics that are considered canon. But some outside sources that I've also used, but are a little bit more problematic, are the God of War novels. Every time I've had to use a section from those books, I feel the need to remind people that the novels are considered secondary canon. This means that as long as the novels don't contradict the games, they can be considered part of the canon. But if a section does contradict the games, then that part has to be thrown out. This makes sense because there are some parts in those books that are obviously in contradiction with the games. My favorite of these moments is the ending of the God of War 2 novel, where it talks about Atlas leading the army of Titans against the gods once again. But if you've played God of War 3, you would know that Atlas is nowhere to be found. In fact, in God of War 2 you can see Atlas being defeated by Poseidon seconds before Kratos brings the Titans to his time. Another moment that really sticks out in the novels is Ares traveling to Egypt, which clearly shows that the writer of the novel was thinking of the world of God of War very differently from what Santa Monica had created. In the novel, Egypt is not a region of the world ruled by Egyptian gods. Instead, it's just another part of the world where the Greek gods just have control over it. This made for an interesting video on the channel a couple of years back, but at the end of the day, this part of the novel can't be taken seriously. But with that said, there are moments in the God of War novels that, despite them being different from the games, are actually better? I know this is downright heretical to say, but it's my honest opinion. Some moments in the novels are better than the ones in the game, and in some instances, it's not even the game's fault. Because books and video games are two very different mediums, this means that they each have their strengths and weaknesses. A strength on the video game side is being able to interact with the world. In no other art medium can you stop in a room to look at the environmental storytelling. So in the same way that video games have their strengths, books also have their own. Because books don't have to worry about things like gameplay pacing, they can take a lot more time to explore characters in the world. And this is something the God of War 1 novel does exceptionally well. While in the game you are locked in with Kratos for the full experience, in the novel the writer keeps up a good pacing by some time taking us to Olympus to get the god's point of view on the events of the game. One of my favorite of these moments is when Athena needs to convince Poseidon to give Kratos some of his powers to defeat the Hydra. In the game you simply enter a room where Poseidon gives Kratos some of his powers, but in the novel we learn that Athena always had to negotiate with the gods to get their help. When it came to Poseidon's rage, she had to use her wisdom powers to get her way. This is because the writer of the novel takes advantage of something that happened between Poseidon and Athena in Greek mythology. According to legend, both Poseidon and Athena had a contest to see who would take Athens as their city. Poseidon wanted to name it Poseidia, and Athena wanted to name it, well, Athens. And as you guessed it by now, Athena won this contest. But this left Poseidon seething with anger. And this is something the writer of the novel took advantage of. Here, Poseidon is still bitter about losing Athens, which leaves Athena no choice but to flatter Poseidon to get his powers. She brings up the fact that Athens' navy was the best of the ancient world. She points out that this was the case because their sailors paid great respect to Poseidon as the ocean's ruler. Throughout the novel, Athena intercedes on Kratos' behalf in very similar ways. When it came time to ask Artemis for help, she convinced her sister to use her animals to delay Ares' undead army from entering Athens. This led to an epic fight between forest animals like bears and wolves against undead legionnaires and Cyclops, a scene that I would have loved to see in the game. And it's like this with every power Kratos gains in the game. Behind them all is Athena's hand. Now these sections don't necessarily contradict the games in any way. They are just adding more background information to what we see in the games, so technically these moments could still be considered canon. However, the novels do take some liberties with some events that do happen in the games. They flat out contradict them, but in my opinion they are even better than what we have in the games. And for this video I wanted to focus on only two of them, the Spear of Destiny and the Architect of Pandora's Temple. The Spear of Destiny is a secondary weapon in God of War 2 that first appears being wielded by the Dark Rider very early in the game. Hours later you can find the spear stuck inside the griffin. Kratos takes it and you as the player never use it because it isn't very fun. Now in the story of the game, the spear is not given any importance, it's just another weapon Kratos obtains. But in the novel, the spear is given a lot more importance. In fact, the writer uses it to answer a question I'm sure some people had regarding God of War 2. How did Kratos find his thread of destiny?
Find your thread, and you will be able to control the mirrors of the fates.
You have to realize that the Sisters of Fate don't control the fate of only the gods and titans. They control the fates of the entire Greek world, so millions of humans if you want to be more exact. But in the game it doesn't take that much time for Kratos to find his thread. His thread is conveniently placed right in front of him. This of course was done to simplify the process of going through millions of threads. No one would bother playing the game if that was the case. But because the novel doesn't have that pacing constraint, it has a lot more room to get creative with this dilemma. In the novel, Kratos has to cut his thread to gain control of his destiny. So unlike in the movie Hercules, cutting one's thread doesn't mean the person dies. In the novel, it means that the person has full autonomy over their destiny, no longer being controlled by the fates. So Kratos has to find his thread and cut it to use the mirrors. But as I pointed out before, there are millions of these threads. At first, Kratos does what you would expect. He presses R1 and square and tries to cut as many threads as he can in one go. But he notices that the blades of Athena are powerless against the threads. So he tries again, now using the Rage of the Titans. And once again, he notices that this power is also ineffective against the threads. After this, Kratos decides to use the Spear of Destiny, and only then is Kratos able to cut through the threads without any problem. This is because, according to the novel, the Spear of Destiny belonged to the Sisters of Fate. In fact, earlier in the novel, the writer depicts the Sisters of Fate as being worried at the thought of Kratos wielding the Spear of Destiny, because with it, not only would he be able to gain control over his destiny, but he could also free as many people as he wished from the control of the Fates. And that's exactly what Kratos does in the Loom Chamber. With one swing of the spear, he frees hundreds of humans from the control of the Fates. This causes the threads to whip about as if they were alive, and from them, the cries of those freed could be heard. In other words, the novel takes a simple moment from the game and amplifies it. It gives it more meaning, as it shows just how much power the Fates had control over the gods and humans. Now, something else the God of War novel does much better than the game is its take on the architect of Pandora's temple, Pathos Verdes III. If this name doesn't sound familiar, I don't blame you. In God of War 1, he isn't a character Kratos comes across in his adventure. Well, he does come across him, but it's a little too late to have a conversation with him. Instead, the writer of the game used the architect's lives as a cautionary tale for Kratos. Much like Kratos, the architect was also a slave to the gods. He was tasked with constructing Pandora's temple. But instead of receiving rewards and fulfillment, the only payment he received were pain and madness. During the construction of the temple, both of the architect's sons died. And in his madness, the only thing he could think of doing to honor their lives was to make them part of the temple itself, as their heads would come to be used as keys for certain doors. I suspect this was one of the reasons he and his wife got into an argument which resulted in both of their deaths. Now, you might see the architect's story as being really tragic, and you're right. But what if I tell you that the novel made his story infinitely more tragic? Now, to explain what I mean, I also need to explain something about the last challenge of Pandora's temple. In the game, the last challenge Kratos has to face is the conveyor belt of death, where Kratos has to fight a large group of enemies while also avoiding being steamrolled into Hades. Now, the novel got rid of this conveyor belt of death and instead made the last challenge more cerebral, something that Kratos couldn't punch his way out. The greatest of the architect's creation, a steam-powered robot. According to the novel, before Kratos was able to get Pandora's box, he had to engage in a battle of wits with the equivalent of a robot from Greek mythology. A robot that went by the name of Antikythera, which in itself is a reference to the Antikythera mechanism found under the sea. The version of the Antikythera from the novel doesn't predict the positions of celestial bodies. Instead, this robot would control all of the traps in Pandora's temple. So in other words, it was an ancient supercomputer. Now this final challenge consisted of solving a little puzzle box. This box was full of needles that could be pressed in. At first, Kratos used one of the Antikythera's fingers to see what would happen if the needles were pressed. And as Kratos suspected, when he pressed in some of the needles, other needles came from the side of the box, dripping with poison. After this, the Antikythera tells Kratos that if he had used his own finger, he would have died on the spot. Now part of the puzzle is that Kratos had to guess the shape that he needed to press on the needles to have access to Pandora's box. And this is where the novel does something remarkable. It goes out of its way to answer a question no one asked while playing the game. Why does every puzzle in the game have a solution? The reason no one asked this question is pretty obvious. The puzzles need a solution because you're playing a video game, and if they didn't have a solution, no one would bother playing. But the writer of the novel takes this obvious answer and makes it part of the story. The reason every puzzle has a solution is because Zeus wanted it that way. Now, Kratos has his revelation in this moment, while talking to the Antikythera. Here, he reasoned that just like every other puzzle he encountered had a solution, the one the Antikythera was given him also had a solution, no matter how difficult it seemed on the surface. And this is when Kratos realizes that there had been multiple puzzles where he had to use the architect's sons' heads as keys to open doors. So surely a similar solution was expected for this puzzle. That's when Kratos called BS on the architect's ability to make a steam-powered robot. So he jumped behind the robot to see what really was inside the helmet. When he managed to break through, he found something very interesting. Inside this steam-powered robot was the undead head of the architect himself. So Kratos took the architect's head and gently placed it inside the poison box, which gave him access to Pandora's box. Again, this version of the architect in the novel isn't drastically different from the one in the game. They serve the same purpose of being a cautionary tale for Kratos. But with the one from the novel, you get a secondary villain, one that's always watching Kratos as he goes through his temple. And this isn't something that only appeals to me. David Jaffe has talked about how he liked a similar idea that was planned for the cancelled God of War movie.
The one thing he did that I just loved, that I wanted to ultimately do in a game if I ever made another God of War, and if not, I hope somebody does it. Pandora's Temple. His idea was that it was Pandora's Temple, but the architect, who's a guy named Paulus Verdes III, was still alive. And as long as he, even though his sons died and stuff, as long as he kept designing the temple, he would survive. And so what was happening was he was kind of sitting somewhere in some chamber, and he was realizing that Kratos was coming in to steal Pandora's box, which would defeat the whole reason to have the temple. And so he didn't want Kratos to succeed. So as he literally was designing on his magic parchment with his magic quill, Pandora's Temple was in real time changing. So he was almost like being a dungeon master in a D&D game,
right, that
was kind of creating traps and monsters and scenarios to stop Kratos from getting to Pandora's box. And it was like this living temple of doom, basically moving around and shifting in real time to stop Kratos and the Oracle. So I thought that was really, really cool.
As you heard from David Jaffe, this idea has a lot of potential, and I wanted to make this video because there have been talks about a possible God of War remake currently being developed. And I was wondering if there could be some new things introduced to the story without breaking the lore that's already there. And when I read the books again, I found that the writers had a couple of interesting ideas that could be added to the remakes. I know I only covered 2 in this video, but there are a lot of similar moments that could also work in the game. So I want to end this video by asking you something. After watching this video, do you think Santa Monica could add some new events and characters to the story? Or do you want the games to remain the same? Whatever your thoughts are, make sure to leave them in the comment section below. Now, as always, I want to give a big thanks to all of my members and Patreon subscribers for supporting the channel monthly. Without your support, guys, I don't think I could do any of the stuff I do in this channel. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you. I would also like to thank everyone who likes and shares my videos. And with that said, thanks for watching. And remember, go forth in the name of Olympus.